In September 1899, on the misty Appalachia highlands, the Ironwood Ridge Mountains entered the early days of autumn with fog so thick that the ground was always wet, as if it had just rained. This was the wettest area in the eastern United States, where humidity exceeded 80% year-round, and any cabin with a poorly placed foundation would rot within 2 seasons. On the eastern slope, the old cabin of the elderly widow Martha Ellerby, 68 years old, stood alone against the first cold winds of the season. She had lived there for 12 years since her husband died in a logging accident in late winter 1887. Every weather report in Madison County warned of the Black Freeze approaching, the harshest winter predicted since 1866, causing valley residents to rush to reinforce roofs, patch chinking, and stockpile more firewood. But while the entire community busily prepared in the way they had for 3 generations, Martha quietly did something that puzzled everyone. At an age when others needed help, she single-handedly dug a trench around the cabin, each section about 10–12 inches deep and wide enough to hold the handfuls of stove ashes she had collected all summer. She poured in the ashes, spread dried oak leaves on top, lightly tamped gravel over them, and created an air gap right against the base of the walls that no one understood the purpose of. All of it was done over 5 consecutive days, regardless of the fog making the soil heavy and cold. Passers-by all witnessed the scene, and no one could hide their doubt. "The old lady's finally gone senile," one said. "Ashes to keep the house dry, leaves to keep the floor warm. In Ironwood Ridge?" The laughter spread faster than the weather forecasts. No one thought what she was doing had anything to do with survival. No one asked why she measured every inch of soil, why she dug exactly along the cabin's perimeter instead of perpendicular to the slope. No one realized that the dampness and cold winds of Appalachia had claimed more lives than wild animals. Martha kept working, without explaining, without looking up when someone commented. By the end of the 5th day, the air skirt barrier completely encircled the cabin, a thin, protective ring that the community saw as meaningless. But the winter of 1899 would prove something no one wanted to admit. There was knowledge held by the elderly that the entire valley had forgotten until the cold forced them to relearn it from scratch. Martha Ellerby was not acting randomly. Her slow and precise movements in the last days of September 1899 were not the whims of a solitary elderly widow on the mountainside, but the result of over 40 years observing the Appalachian climate and technical lessons few contemporaries still remembered. She had been taught by her mother-in-law, a woman from the Eastern Band Cherokee community, how to read wind directions, how to judge soil color to predict water retention, and how to use stove ashes as a natural moisture-absorbing layer. When younger, she had learned more from a group of Scottish stonemasons who migrated to the mountains in the 1852, who explained to her the phenomenon of capillary rise and why gravel could force water to move underground instead of upward into the cabin's frame. The longer she lived in Ironwood Ridge, the more she understood that the problem with Appalachian cabins was not in the walls, but right beneath the house where moisture could penetrate every wood fiber unseen. Before digging the trench, Martha stood still for many minutes to determine the valley wind direction in October, measured the slope with a wooden stick, and checked the fog cycle that usually appeared at 5 a.m. She also observed the rainwater flow paths along the forest edge, knowing that if even one stream flowed the wrong way, the entire effort would be wasted. Every layer of material she placed had a technical reason. Stove ashes absorbed moisture and resisted mold better than anything she had ever tried. Oak and poplar leaves, if dried properly over 7 sunny days, created a dead air space that stabilized temperature around the cabin foundation. The gravel lightly tamped on top was not to hold things in place, but to force water to flow outward instead of pooling near the walls. Finally, the intentional air gap Martha left was the key element, a small but sufficient void to reduce temperature differentials, preventing the wood from expanding and contracting excessively during freeze-thaw cycles. All the ratios, the trench depth of 10–12 inches, the 2-inch ash layer thickness, the 3-degree gravel slope were recorded in her late husband's old notebook, one that many thought was just a meaningless work journal. Passers-by saw her sweep ashes with a small broom, measure every inch with a piece of twine, lay gravel along the curve following the cabin base, but no one understood why she was so persistent. To the community, those actions were just the stubbornness of an old woman. In reality, it was a forgotten ancient technique that Martha carefully revived, step by step, as if preparing the cabin for something greater than any previous winter. But as Martha continued digging, spreading ashes, and laying gravel around the cabin in the early days of October, 1899, her patience became the talk of the entire Ironwood Ridge Valley. The men gathered outside Bell's trading post all shook their heads as if witnessing something absurd. "Here, just stone piers have been enough for 50 years, one said, pointing toward the valley where dozens of cabins still stood from their grandfather's time. Another laughed. "The old lady's doing some kind of witchcraft. What can ashes and leaves hold except a smoky smell?" They spoke with absolute certainty, because, in Appalachia, tradition carried weight almost like doctrine. Preacher Allen, after hearing parishioners recount Martha digging the trench around her cabin, declared from the pulpit on Sunday morning, "What is unnatural rarely brings good." He did not name her directly, but everyone knew whom he meant. Carpenter Mills, with 32 years in the trade, stood outside the store taking a drag on his pipe and said, "If ashes could keep things dry, we'd have used them long ago. Forest fires are more believable." Though many meant no malice, they still believed what they knew was enough. What they had done for generations was right, and anything else was suspicious. That very conservatism had caused the Appalachian community to overlook useful techniques many times simply because they differed from what their ancestors did. Martha heard the distant laughter but did not react. She remained silent, her hands steadily scooping handfuls of ashes into the trench, adjusting the dried oak layer to just the right thickness, checking whether the gravel sloped correctly for drainage. She worked as if the valley's voices could not reach her. The children running past the slope each afternoon had their own name for her project. "Ghost Trench," they shouted, half scared and half thrilled, then ran off when Martha turned to look. They did not understand what she was doing, only that a trench circling a cabin looked strange, completely unlike anything they had ever seen. The gossip grew daily. Some valley women whispered that old age had made Martha senile, while the men insisted she was wasting energy on something useless. No one thought to ask why, and even fewer considered that what they had always accepted as standard might have been wrong from the start. In that atmosphere, Martha's silence made the entire community uncomfortable. No arguing, no defending, no explaining. She just kept working, as if between her and the damp Appalachian soil there existed an agreement only she understood. Anyone watching would clearly sense the injustice creeping through every glance, because a crowd's laughter is not always based on understanding. And in that simmering tension, one thing became obvious. Ironwood Ridge Valley was laughing at something they had never tried to understand. But that winter would make them all pay for their overconfidence. The skepticism in the valley persisted until a few people began noticing that their cabins were showing early signs of seasonal dampness that Martha's cabin completely lacked. To understand this, one must look at the technical differences the Appalachian community had ignored for generations. Traditional cabins in the region were usually built on stone piers, only about 8–12 inches high, a height thought sufficient but which actually placed the floor almost within the perpetual damp zone of Ironwood Ridge. The soil here held water for long periods, with moisture rising straight from the ground and penetrating the wood through capillary action, causing the sill logs to darken after just 1–2 rainy seasons. When moisture accumulated, evaporative cooling caused heat loss to occur much faster, making cabins far colder at night even with the fireplace burning. Cold floors led to cold air, forcing every family to burn 20–30% more firewood each winter just to maintain basic, livable conditions. Moreover, the low height of stone piers created ideal conditions for mice, snakes, and especially termites to enter, since the warm, damp environment around the foundation was perfect for nesting. During freeze-thaw cycles, the constant alternation of freezing and thawing, the damp wood expanded and contracted unevenly, causing traditional cabin foundations to crack, warp, or settle after just a few harsh seasons. What the entire valley saw as a natural cycle was actually the technical consequence of foundations too close to the ground with no moisture control mechanism. Martha's cabin operated on a completely different principle, and that difference made it superior from the start. The ash trench she dug was not senility, but a true capillary break. The ashes absorbed moisture from the soil and held it in the lower layer, preventing water vapor from continuing upward toward the cabin. The layer of dried oak and poplar leaves formed a dead air layer, a stable air pocket that reduced thermal bridging the transfer of cold from soil to cabin floor. The gravel Martha spread on top created a plane that forced rainwater to move outward instead of pooling around the foundation. As a result, water never accumulated near the cabin base, greatly reducing the risk of wood rot or termite habitat. The intentional air gap she left transformed the cabin into a breathing structure. Cold outside air entered, met the warmer ash layer and temperature-stabilized dry leaves, creating gentle air convection around the foundation. This airflow balanced humidity, prevented condensation under the floor, and limited extreme wood expansion, contraction during freeze-thaw cycles. While traditional Appalachian cabins always suffered cold as ice floors and mold after just a few rains, Martha's cabin was 4-8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, 20–30% lower in humidity, and showed no signs of mold or warping. A few people in the valley, seeing their own floors start to soften after the fourth rain, began wondering why the old woman's cabin appeared completely unaffected, but they still lied to themselves that it was just luck. None of them understood that Martha had inadvertently recreated a lost moisture control technique, combining ancient Cherokee knowledge with Scottish stonemason experience and 40 years of observing Appalachian nature. And that was only autumn. The harsh winter ahead would reveal just how significant this technical difference truly was. Those technical analyses remained limited to those who truly paid attention until the first real challenge of the cold season struck Ironwood Ridge. In early November 1899, steady rain began, and unlike previous years when rain lasted 5 to 7 days then stopped, this time it continued for 22 straight days. The fog never lifted, moisture clung to every surface, and the soil on the slopes became so heavy that every footstep sank half an inch. For Appalachian residents, prolonged rain was something they were used to enduring, but even the oldest in the area could not recall rain lasting that long. And as every year, traditional cabins began revealing their weaknesses from the first week. At the Rowley home, a nearly 2-foot soft spot appeared in the kitchen floor. Every step produced a squish, sound like wood being squeezed of water. Mold smell began escaping from the north wall corner, where the foundation was only 8 inches off the ground. The Cartwright family discovered termites crawling around the pier tops on the 11th day of rain. High humidity softened the wood, allowing termites to chew through the bark in just a few nights. In other cabins, especially those lower in the valley, like the Sanderson or McAfee homes, dried food hanging from the beams also began absorbing moisture. Cornmeal clumped, dried beans oozed slight water, and salted meat bags gave off strange odors, signs Appalachian women always saw as bad omens for winter. These problems spread almost simultaneously, as if Ironwood Ridge was collectively reminding residents that their homes had never been truly safe from dampness. But while cabins throughout the valley endured every kind of trouble, Martha's cabin stood calm before the rain, as if it existed in a different climate. After more than 10 days of rain, her cabin floor remained completely dry. The floorboards retained their pale yellow color, with no dark water stains, no swelling spots. When she placed her hand on the wood on the morning of the 15th day, it was still warmer than the air temperature, thanks to the dead air layer beneath reducing heat loss. Inside the cabin, there was no damp smell, no mold odor, and no vapor rising when she opened the door at dawn. Martha's fireplace, though burning less than usual, still kept the cabin 4–6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than others. This began drawing notice, especially from those whose cabins were deteriorating quickly. Carpenter Mills, passing Martha's cabin on the 18th day of rain, paused for a moment to listen whether the wood under her feet made the creak his own house did. He heard nothing but rain hitting the roof. The elderly woman still walked lightly on the old floor, as if her house was unaffected by Appalachian climate. This difference made some uncomfortable, others curious, and a few even slightly anxious because if their cabins were failing so fast, it meant something in the way they had built for generations was fundamentally wrong. But in the end, like every conservative community, they dismissed the unease with a familiar phrase, just luck. They did not know that luck cannot last, and the rain was only the first warning of the worst winter in decades. But the real challenge was not the rain. It came right after, when Ironwood Ridge entered the first cold days of December 1899. A northern wind surge caused temperatures to drop from 38 degrees Fahrenheit to 14 degrees Fahrenheit in a single night, then rise to 34 degrees Fahrenheit by noon, before falling again to 10 degrees Fahrenheit the next morning. That was the first freeze-thaw cycle. 2 days later, it repeated a second time, then a third. For Appalachian residents, such weather was not rare, but that year the temperature swings were so abrupt that the entire valley felt unsettled, and the traditional cabins built in the passed-down from father to son style began revealing wounds no one wanted to see. At the Rowley home, a small crack in the rear sill log, only about 3 inches long the previous week, widened to nearly 9 inches after the second cycle. Damp wood froze, thawed, and froze again quickly, causing uneven fiber expansion and contraction. In the Cartwright cabin's northeast corner, a floorboard warped upward a full inch, tilting the dining table noticeably. Some lower valley cabins settled slightly, not enough to collapse, but enough to cause wood groaning every time someone walked. Damp smell from beneath grew stronger, and ground cold rose, forcing many families to burn an extra third of their firewood reserves, though winter had not officially begun. All these phenomena had explanations in physics that no one in the valley noticed. When damp soil froze, water expanded and pushed the cabin foundation up a fraction of an inch. When ice melted, soil settled, creating gaps and slight foundation tilting. Repeated expansion and contraction loosened wooden joints, creating cracks for cold wind to enter. Low, damp cabins without air barriers like the traditional Appalachian style were especially vulnerable in such weather. But Martha's cabin stood firm. No settling, no cracks, no warped wood, no floor groaning. When she touched the sill log early in the morning after the third freeze-thaw cycle, the wood was still dry and warmer than the air. This made Mills, the carpenter with 32 years of experience, begin to see what he had never admitted. The old woman's cabin was not affected by the weather like his own. He stood outside Martha's cabin on the morning of December 6, looking down at the darkened but still dry ash trench, watching her walk on the floor without any cracking sounds, and noticing no cold air rising from the ground as in his home. And for the first time in his life, he wondered whether his 32 years of experience had a blind spot he had never recognized. He did not tell anyone. But that evening, when Mills had to wedge a piece of wood under a table leg because his floor had settled slightly, he remembered Martha's cabin and felt an unease rise like a truth suppressed too long. Some still said she was lucky. But if it was luck, why was her cabin the only one on the slope that made no sound when temperatures dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit? Why was her floor still flat and unwarped while the entire valley complained? No one answered, and no one wanted to. But those freeze-thaw cycles quietly planted doubt in even the most stubborn minds. Perhaps what they had mocked for weeks was not nonsense. Perhaps the old woman understood Appalachia better than they thought, and then winter had not truly begun. What was coming would no longer be warnings, it would be the opening of a disaster. That unease was only the prelude. The real disaster began on the night of the 14th of December 1899, when the air suddenly grew so still that one could hear dry branches cracking under thin ice. A mass of cold air from Canada swept down the Appalachia highlands, meeting the thick, moist layer typical of Ironwood Ridge, creating a phenomenon even the oldest residents rarely witnessed, an ice storm. The ice storm lasted 72 uninterrupted hours, coating every roof with up to 2 inches of ice and turning the entire valley into an emotionless frozen mirror. In the first 24 hours, temperatures fell from 18 degrees Fahrenheit to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, then continued dropping to 25 degrees Fahrenheit by the dawn of the third day. Northeast winds made the ice tremble lightly on cabin roofs, producing sounds like cold whispers through the pine forest. The traditional cabins, already damaged earlier, began revealing weaknesses to a dangerous degree. At the Rowley home, the cabin floor froze solid. Moisture trapped beneath, meeting 25 degrees Fahrenheit, formed thin ice sheets that pushed the floorboards upward with regular pop sounds. Every step made the house shake slightly, as if standing on an empty box. Their 4-year-old child struggled to breathe as ground cold rose whenever the wind shifted, dropping indoor temperature faster than the fire could compensate. The Cartwright home suffered even worse. Their roof began sagging after 48 hours as accumulated ice grew too heavy, bending rafters nearly 2 inches. Moisture absorbed from the rainy season had weakened wooden joints, now unable to bear the ice weight. Prior termite damage, combined with moisture freezing in earlier cycles, caused the south foundation to start collapsing. First a slight crack, then a loud snap that panicked the family. They had to abandon the cabin in the storm, wrapping blankets around themselves and running through thick ice to find temporary shelter. A few low-valley cabins fared even worse. Condensation on walls met deep cold, forming thin ice from inside out. Young children struggled to breathe in the damp cold. Adults coughed violently in the heavy air. These cabins nearly lost all heat retention. Indoor temperatures were only 6–8 degrees Fahrenheit above outside, despite constant burning of firewood. Wind slipped through new cracks like knife cuts. Amid all the chaos, Martha's cabin stood firm as if built for a different climate. Its floor did not freeze. The air gap around the foundation allowed continuous convection, preventing cold from solidifying beneath. Ashes in the trench maintained stable warmth, absorbing moisture and blocking capillary action, preventing extreme foundation movement. Oak leaves held a stable dry air pocket, minimizing thermal bridging. When Martha touched the sill log on the second night, the wood was still nearly 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding ground. Her small fire, using less than half the firewood others burned, kept the cabin 12–15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than any in the valley. Outside, the ice storm turned Ironwood Ridge into a violent wasteland where tree branches crashed under ice weight. But from Martha's cabin window, the yellow lamplight glowed steadily, as if the outside weather could not touch it. The third night of the ice storm was when everything exceeded many families' endurance. The Rowley floor was nearly cracking, temperatures dangerously low for children. They decided to run to Martha's cabin, carrying only blankets and some firewood. The Cartwrights, after their south foundation partially collapsed, carried their children through ankle-deep ice in the freezing blizzard, nearly falling repeatedly. Another family, the Sandersons, had their door blocked by external ice and had to break the back door to escape. When all 3 families reached the eastern slope where Martha's cabin stood silent in the storm, they saw a scene almost completely opposite to what they had fled. Light from the old woman's cabin still shone steadily, not flickering despite strong winds. The roof did not sag under ice. Smoke from the chimney rose straight, not torn by gusts. From afar, the small cabin looked like the only point of light in a world covered in ice and despair. When Martha opened the door to welcome them, warmth poured out like a lifeline they thought they would never feel again. The floor was dry, warm, with no mold smell, no wood cracking sounds. Those families stood still for several seconds, unable to believe an old cabin could stand firm in the worst disaster in 30 years. And that was the moment when all the mockery, all the ridicule, all the dismissal of an elderly widow's technique suddenly became absurd. On that ice storm night, Martha's cabin was not just shelter, it was living proof that the entire valley had been wrong from the beginning, and winter was still long. But from that moment, no one dared belittle what she had done anymore. As the ice storm gradually thawed on the morning of the 4th day, Ironwood Ridge looked like a land that had just emerged from a long nightmare. The ground was covered in shattered ice chunks, broken branches lay scattered everywhere, and dark stains around the cabin foundations in the valley were remnants of moisture that had repeatedly frozen and thawed. But even amid that devastation, one image stood out so prominently that no one could ignore it. The line of people standing in front of Martha Ellerby's cabin. They were the same people who, just weeks earlier, had mocked her, who had called her ash trench a ghost trench, who had believed their own experience was enough for any Appalachian winter. Now they crowded together on the slope, wrapped in thick blankets, feet still crusted with ice, faces gaunt from sleeplessness and cold. The 3 families who had fled to her in the night were the first, but word spread quickly, bringing many more households up the slope that morning. Even Preacher Allen, who had once called Martha's work unnatural, stood in the line, hat pulled low as if to hide the regret weighing on his shoulders. No one spoke first. No one wanted to recall what they had said about her. They only knew one thing. Martha's cabin had stood firm when theirs had nearly collapsed. When Martha opened the door, she looked at them for a long time, without reproach, without bringing up the past. Only when she saw a child shivering in its mother's arms did she softly tell the group to come inside and warm up. Then, Once they were settled, and the heat from the fireplace had eased, the fear still etched on their faces, Martha spoke, in a slow but clear voice. "You don't need strength to survive a mountain winter. You need to understand the ground beneath you." Those words silenced the entire cabin. They understood she was not talking about soil in the ordinary sense. She was speaking of humility before nature, of observing what they had dismissed, and of knowledge that the valley's younger generation had unwittingly forgotten. After the storm fully cleared, Martha stepped outside and began showing them how to dig a trench to the proper depth. She drove a wooden stake into the ground, measured every inch, and explained why the trench had to slope southeast for natural drainage. She showed them how to mix ashes from 3 different woods for optimal moisture absorption. She talked about the right time to dry oak leaves they had to dry for exactly 7 sunny days, or they would hold moisture instead of air. She demonstrated how to spread gravel without compacting it too hard, forcing water to flow outward. And most importantly, she showed how to create the air channel, a small but critical air gap that determined the survival of the entire cabin foundation in winter. Mills, the lifelong carpenter devoted to traditional methods, listened without interrupting once. At times he knelt by the trench and touched the ash layer, as if discovering something he had never noticed in 32 years. The others followed, digging, spreading ashes, laying gravel, drying leaves, checking every detail she mentioned. There was no more mockery, no more scoffing or whispering behind backs, only the silence of people realizing for the first time that they had been wrong, and that a quiet elderly widow living on the slope understood Ironwood Ridge better than all of them combined. And on that warming morning, as thin sunlight pierced the melting ice, no one in the valley knew they had just witnessed the beginning of a change that would outlast their own lives. Martha's instruction did not end with one morning after the storm. It became the start of the quietest yet most profound rebuilding Ironwood Ridge had ever seen. On the 17th of December, 1899, with temperatures still below 20 degrees Fahrenheit and ice not fully melted from cabin roofs, the first 10 families began repairing their foundations exactly as Martha had taught. They dug trenches around their cabins, lined them with ashes, spread oak leaves, adjusted gravel, and left air channels in the precise ratios she had recorded. No one thought they had the strength for such work in midwinter, but the desperation after the ice storm made every family realize that either they acted or winter would collapse their cabins again. Mills, the veteran carpenter, not only joined, but became the leader guiding the valley men. He measured every slope angle, aligned every trench inch, and shook his head whenever he recalled his own words about her. If ashes could keep things dry, we'd have used them long ago. 3 days later, as he stood up from the Rowley cabin foundation and saw the newly stabilized base, he could no longer hold back that thought. He said softly, loud enough for the group to hear, "The old widow out-engineered all of us." No one objected, no one laughed, no one felt insulted, because in that moment, they all knew it was true. After the first 10 cabins finished repairs, results appeared faster than expected. Within 48 hours, floor temperatures in those cabins rose an average of 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity dropped sharply, from around 85% to 50–55%. One home even recorded a nearly 40% reduction, keeping dried food intact, with no mold smell and no condensation on walls. Those numbers spread through the valley faster than news of the ice storm. The Rowley family was the first to tell the community they slept in their cabin without burning firewood all night. The Cartwrights, whose foundation had partially collapsed, were amazed when the floor was completely dry the next morning. People realized Martha's technique not only saved cabins in the storm but also reduced firewood costs, respiratory illnesses, and termite damage. Within a week, 14 more cabins asked Martha for guidance. The line between those who had mocked and those who had doubted vanished completely. Each family brought their own ashes, and each asked the same question: "Can you show us how to do it right?" As 1,899 ended, and the ice of the Great Appalachian Ice Winter gradually melted, the story of the elderly widow on the slope no longer stayed within Ironwood Ridge. Fur traders from the west carried the news to Tennessee. A group of loggers retold it to relatives in West Virginia. A Cartwright uncle took the story all the way to Kentucky when he went down the mountain for salt. By February 1900, the tale of the ash trench technique had spread far enough that a regional Appalachian foothills magazine, Southern Homestead Gazette, published a short article with a headline that stunned the entire valley when they read it. An elderly widow saved a mountain valley with ashes and leaves. That simple line served as an official stamp on what the community had once rejected. They had been saved by a technique they had scorned, and from the moment that article appeared, no one called what she did a ghost trench anymore. They gave it a new name, clear and undeniable, Ellerby Dry Skirt Method. And starting in 1900, that name would travel farther than Martha ever imagined. News of the Ellerby Dry Skirt Method spread faster than any story Ironwood Ridge had ever known. In early spring 1900, when the ice fully melted and residents began assessing winter damage, the difference between cabins that adopted Martha's technique and those that kept traditional foundations became too obvious to deny. Cabins repaired according to her guidance were dry, warm, and showed almost no deterioration. Those that did nothing had damp floors, tilted foundations, and termites still gnawing along lingering moisture paths. That contrast drew attention from neighboring counties. In April 1900, a delegation from Haywood County traveled to Ironwood Ridge to see the rumored technique for themselves. They measured floor temperatures, checked wood humidity, and even took ash samples from trenches to analyze back home. A week later, Swain County sent a letter asking Martha to describe the method in writing for inclusion in their cabin repair guidelines before winter. Soon after, Greene County in Tennessee, then Mingo County in West Virginia, updated their winter building recommendations with one special note: prioritize the ash trench method based on the Ironwood Ridge model. A technique once laughed at was now in official documents, but the widest spread came in 1902, when a small team of engineers from the Appalachian Highlands Agricultural School visited Martha's own cabin. They brought primitive humidity gauges, metal thermometers, and a thick notebook. They measured cabin humidity: 48%. Traditional cabins in the same area ranged from 72% to 85%. They recorded a 12 degrees Fahrenheit floor temperature difference in the morning and 9 degrees Fahrenheit at night compared to others. They examined the ash trench, measured its depth, and checked airflow beneath the floor. When they left Ironwood Ridge, they had enough data to do what Martha never imagined in her lifetime: standardize the method into a true technical manual. In 1902, the Appalachian Highlands Agricultural School published an 18-page guide titled Ellerby Air Skirt Foundation Guide, 1902 edition. It described every step: trench depth, ash thickness, oak leaf drying process, gravel ratios, drainage direction, plus diagrams of the air channel. The guide stated clearly, this technique significantly improves heat retention and moisture resistance in mountain cabins. Proven effective during the 1899 winter at Ironwood Ridge. When the guide was sent to other agricultural schools across the Appalachian Highlands, many professors began teaching its principles in classes on farming, climate, and natural materials. They spoke of capillary break as an official term. They used small cabin models to show students the difference between traditional foundations and air skirt ones. Some schools even included Martha's cabin example in final exams. In many highland communities, people started building new cabins with ash trenches from the start, rather than waiting for rot to force repairs. Lumber traders and carpenters passing through Ironwood Ridge always carried a copy of the 1902 guide as an essential part of their toolkit. From mockery, Martha's technique became standard. From being seen as the odd act of an old woman on a slope, it became an official lesson in Appalachian agricultural engineering classes. And from saving just one cabin in the 1899 ice storm, it began changing how an entire mountain region viewed a home's foundation. But what Martha never knew and never tried to care about was that those changes were only the beginning of the true legacy she left behind. As her method spread across the region and became a building standard for many mountain communities, Martha continued living quietly on the eastern slope of Ironwood Ridge, in the very cabin that had saved the entire valley during the worst winter of the century. She never claimed to have invented anything new. When people came to thank her, she only said one thing: I just did what our ancestors did. Everyone else had simply forgotten. And true to that simplicity, her final years passed at a slow pace. Each morning she brewed tea, opened the window to watch fog drift through the valley, Each afternoon she swept the yard, adjusted the ash trench, even though it had worked perfectly for years. She never thought her method would travel beyond Ironwood Ridge, let alone that agricultural schools or mountain engineers would mention her name in research documents. But legacies always follow their own path. Martha Ellerby lived 14 more years after the winter of 1899, and she passed away in her warm cabin on a spring morning in 1913 when the indoor temperature was still nearly 10 degrees Fahrenheit higher than outside, a final testament to the effectiveness of the technique she left behind. On the simple stone grave marker beneath an oak tree, Valley residents carved the words, "She kept warmth where others found only cold." No long praise, no list of achievements, just one sentence enough to tell the story of a woman who understood Appalachia by its very heartbeat. In 1915, Madison County authorities officially recognized Martha's cabin as a historical site, noting, "The place marking the revival of a traditional technique that saved hundreds of highland homes." Groups of students, researchers, and young carpenters from Tennessee, West Virginia, and Kentucky all came to see the original ash trench around the cabin, a humble structure that changed how mountain people prepared for winter. They bent down to examine the darkened ash layer, the mostly decayed leaves, yet the air channel remained intact, as if time itself respected the work. And so her story, from a mocked elderly widow to the creator of a building standard, became a lesson passed down through generations. That innovation is not always something new. Sometimes it is old wisdom we stopped listening to. The story's philosophical conclusion, therefore, rings clear. Innovation isn't always new. Sometimes it's wisdom we stopped listening to. If you want to continue exploring tales of forgotten knowledge, secrets that once saved entire communities but nearly vanished with time, please follow the channel so you don't miss any journey through this vast mountain region. If you love stories about forgotten wisdom that quietly saved whole communities, please subscribe to the channel to join us on the journeys ahead. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.